The deer was a ghost in the morning mist, a fleeting, dappled shape against the backdrop of rust-colored ferns and gray, lichen-splotched birch trees. For a breathless moment, it was perfectly still, its head raised, its large, liquid eyes searching the air for a danger it could not yet see but could feel in the sudden stillness of the forest. Kale was also still, a predator carved from shadow at the edge of the clearing. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a wild rhythm that he feared the deer could hear across the 50 paces that separated them. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wooden shaft of his spear. The weapon felt clumsy in his hands, an extension not of his will but of his inadequacy. The point, a lump of gray chert he had hastily chipped into a semblance of sharpness, was too broad, too heavy. It threw the balance of the spear off, and he knew it. He had known it when he'd tied it to the shaft with wet sinew, and he had felt it in every step of the stalk. But the clan's stores were low, the scent of the coming winter was already on the wind, and the pressure from the other young hunters, particularly the brash and successful Turok, was a constant, galling weight. He had no choice. Turok had brought down a wild boar 2 days prior, its tusks still caked in mud, and had swaggered into the camp, dropping the carcass at the feet of the chieftain Borin. The clan had feasted, and Turok had been the hero of the hour, his laughter loud by the fire as he recounted the hunt, his eyes often flicking to Kale with a look of casual contempt. Kale, whose last 3 hunts had yielded nothing but sore feet and the bitter taste of failure, had felt the eyes of the clan on him, felt their unspoken disappointment. Now the deer's ear twitched. A bird, startled by Kale's scent, let out a sharp, warning cry. The moment was gone. The deer exploded into motion, a blur of white tail and brown hide, vanishing into the trees with an effortless grace that Kale could only dream of. He let out a frustrated sigh, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent forest. With a grunt of self-loathing, he hurled his spear at a large birch tree. It struck with a dull thud, the flawed point shattering on impact, sending useless shards of chert scattering into the undergrowth. He was left holding a useless stick. He slumped to the ground, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. It was always the same. His aim was true, his stalking patient, but his tools betrayed him. The edges of his scrapers would dull halfway through cleaning a hide. The points of his spears would break. He could see the shape of the perfect tool in his mind's eye, a leaf-shaped point of translucent flint, its edges as keen as a shard of ice, but his hands could not coax it from the stone. They were clumsy, impatient hands, good for hauling wood or wrestling a log into the fire pit, but useless for the delicate, violent art of flint knapping. When he returned to the cave encampment, empty-handed and carrying his broken spear, Turok was there, mending a net by the river. He looked up, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his broad face. "Did the trees prove too fast for you, Kale?" he called out, his voice carrying across the water. A few of the women, cleaning hides on the flat rocks, chuckled. Kale's face burned with shame. He ignored Turok and stalked past, heading for the great cave that was the heart of their clan. Borin, the chieftain, was waiting for him. He was a man of few words, his authority flowing not from speeches but from a deep, unshakable calm. He looked at the broken spear in Kale's hand, then at Kale's face. His expression was not one of anger, but of something more profound, a kind of weary disappointment. "A hunter's life is in his point," Borin said, his voice a low rumble. "Your points are full of air and wishes. They do not hold the spirit of the stone." He gestured with his chin towards the far, shadowed end of the great cavern, a place set apart from the communal living area, where the smoke of a small, solitary fire sometimes curled towards the ceiling. "It is time. You will learn from Gore." Kale's heart sank. Gore. The name itself was a hard, guttural sound, like a rock striking rock. Gore was the oldest man in the clan, a relic from a previous age. He did not live in the main part of the cave with the others. He kept to himself in a small side chamber, a space that was both his workshop and his hermitage. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a dry rasp, as if his words were flakes chipped from a core of silence. But the tools he made were legends. The spearheads were things of lethal beauty, perfectly balanced, their edges so sharp they could shave the fur from a sleeping fox. His flint knives could part a deer's hide as if it were water. His hand axes could fell a young tree with a few, well-placed blows. He was not a toolmaker. He was a master, a shaman of the stone. But he was also a creature of immense, unassailable solitude. He had not taken an apprentice in Cale's lifetime. The story, whispered by the elders, was that his last one, a boy many years ago, had been lost to a hunting accident involving one of Gore's own creations, a tragedy that had walled Gore's heart in stone. To be sent to Gore was not an opportunity. It was a punishment. It was an admission of Cale's utter failure. With a heavy heart, Cale made his way towards the back of the cave. The air grew cooler, the familiar sounds of the clan, the chatter of women, the cries of children, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of someone working wood faded, replaced by a profound silence broken only by the drip of water from a high fissure and the soft hiss of Gore's fire. He found the old man sitting cross-legged on a worn hide, his back to the entrance of his small chamber. He was hunched over a large, dark stone held in his lap. His body was a gnarled, twisted thing, like an ancient olive tree, but his hands were instruments of impossible precision. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen, the skin as tough as old leather, but they moved with a fluid, focused grace. In one hand he held a smooth, rounded river stone. In the other, a piece of antler. He was not looking at the stone in his lap, but past it, his gaze fixed on something in the shadows, as if listening. Cale stood at the entrance, shifting his weight from foot to foot, unsure of how to announce himself. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Borin sent me," he mumbled. Gore did not turn. He did not acknowledge Cale's presence in any way. He simply continued to stare into the darkness. For a long, awkward moment, the only sound was the dripping of water. Cale began to feel foolish, an unwelcome intruder in a sacred space. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, Gore struck the large stone with his hammerstone. Crack! The sound was as sharp as a whip, echoing in the small chamber. A large, curved flake of flint, as long as Cale's forearm, detached from the core and fell silently onto the hide-covered floor. Gore picked it up, his fingers tracing its razor-sharp edge. He held it up to the firelight, and Cale could see the ripples on its surface, the conchoidal fracture lines that marked the passage of the shockwave he had sent through the stone. It was perfect. Gore finally turned his head, his eyes fixing on Cale. They were pale, clouded eyes, like chips of ancient ice, and they seemed to look straight through Cale, weighing his spirit, measuring his worth, and finding him wanting. "Borin sent me a boy who cannot speak to the stone," Gore rasped, his voice dry and brittle. "So the stone will not speak to him. Why should I waste my words? I want to learn," Cale said. His voice a little stronger now, a spark of defiance kindled by the old man's dismissiveness. Gore let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Wanting is a child's game. The stone does not care what you want, cares what you know. And you know nothing." He gestured to a pile of rocks near the entrance of his chamber. It was a chaotic jumble of different stones, flint, chert, quartz, granitief, all shapes and sizes. "Your first lesson. Sort them." Cale stared at the pile, bewildered. "Sort them? How?" "That is the lesson," Gore said, turning his back on Cale and picking up another coarse stone, his attention already lost again to his work. For the rest of that day, Cale sorted rocks. At first, he tried to sort them by size, placing the large ones in one pile, the small ones in another. When Gore took no notice, he sorted them by color, the blacks, the grays, the reds. Still, the old man ignored him. Frustrated, Cale sat and stared at the pile, trying to understand. What did Gore want? He began to pick up the stones, to feel them. He noticed that some were smooth and waxy, with a strange, glassy texture. Others were rough and granular. Some were heavy and dense, others surprisingly light. He began to tap them together. The waxy, dark gray stones made a high-pitched, ringing sound when struck. The dull, chalky white ones made a low, dead thud. Without consciously thinking about it, he began to sort them by the sound they made, by the feel of them in his hand. He put all the waxy, ringing stones in one pile. These were the flints and the fine-grained cherts. He put the granular, rough stones in another. He separated the hard, dense hammerstones from the soft, brittle sandstones. By the time the light began to fade from the main cavern, he had 4 distinct piles of rock. He had learned the first page of the stone's silent language, the language of texture, weight, and sound. He looked up at Gore. The old man had not moved, but Cale felt his gaze on him. Gore grunted, a sound that held the barest hint of something other than contempt. The boy has ears, at least. Come back at dawn. The next days followed a similar pattern. Gore set Cale to tasks that seemed pointless, demeaning. He had him fetch water, not in a waterskin, but in a large, curved piece of bark that spilled half its contents on the way back. He learned to cup the bark, to walk with a slow, measured gait to balance the load. He had him build and tend the fire, not with large, easy logs, but with tiny, dry twigs that had to be fed to the flames one by one. He learned patience, how to nurture a flame from a single spark, how to control its heat. Each task was a lesson in disguise, a lesson in focus, patience, and economy of motion. Cale, who had always rushed headlong into every task, was being forced to slow down, to think, to observe. And all the while, Gore worked, his hammerstone rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Cale watched him, mesmerized. He saw how Gore would turn the core stone over and over in his hands, sometimes for an hour, before delivering a single, decisive blow. He saw how he prepared the edge of the core, the striking platform, abrading it with a rough stone to give the hammerstone purchase. He was learning not just with his hands, but with his eyes. Finally, after a week of these strange trials, Gore gestured for Cale to sit opposite him. He pushed a small, fist-sized nodule of gray flint across the hide. "You have learned to listen with your hands and your eyes," Gore said. "Now you will learn to speak." He handed Cale a smooth, quartzite hammerstone. "The stone has a heart. The blow does not break the stone. It travels through it. You must see the path of the blow before you strike. You must see the flake you want to remove before it is born. Now strike." Cale's heart pounded. This was it. He held the core stone in one hand, the hammerstone in the other. He tried to mimic Gore's posture, his focus. He tried to see the path of the blow. He aimed for a ridge on the stone and swung. Thwack! The hammerstone glanced off the core with a dull, unsatisfying sound. A few tiny, useless chips flew off. Cale had struck too tentatively, his angle was wrong. Gore sighed, a sound like leaves skittering over dry rock. "You asked the stone a question, and it gave you a fool's answer. The stone does not reward cowards. Strike as if you mean it. Do not ask. Tell it what to do." Cale took a deep breath. He set his jaw, focused on a point just inside the stone's surface, and swung again, putting the weight of his shoulder into it. Crack! The core stone split neatly in two, the fracture clean but uncontrolled. He had created 2 useless halves. He had killed the stone. He looked up at Gore, expecting a torrent of scorn. But Gore simply picked up one of the broken halves. "Good," he said, surprising Cale. "Now you know what happens when you speak with anger instead of knowledge. You have made a loud noise and said nothing. Now you have 2 smaller stones to kill. We have a mountain full of stones. We will not run out before you learn. Pick up the other half." And so it began. For days, Cale did nothing but break rocks. He broke them with anger, with frustration, with impatience. He shattered them into useless fragments. His hands became raw, his arms ached. The pile of broken, wasted flint grew into a small mountain of its own, a monument to his failure. Turok would often stroll by the entrance to Gore's chamber, a smirk on his face as he looked at the growing pile of debris. "Making gravel, Cale?" he would jeer. "Perhaps the women can use it to line the cooking pit." Cale's spirit began to wither. The hope he had felt was being ground down, chipped away like the flint he was destroying. He was a failure. Gore was a madman. Oren had made a mistake. One afternoon, after shattering a particularly fine piece of black flint, he threw the hammerstone down in disgust. "I can't do it!" he exclaimed, his voice raw with frustration. "I cannot see inside the stone. It is just rock." Gore, who had been working on a delicate, serrated blade, set his own work down. He looked at Cale, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to lose their icy distance. He saw not just a clumsy apprentice, but a boy drowning in his own despair. "You look at the stone, but you do not see it," Gore said, his voice softer than Cale had ever heard it. He picked up a new, untouched nodule of flint. "You think the tool is something you make, something you force upon the stone. You are wrong. The tool is already inside. It has been sleeping in there since the mountain was born. The napper's job is not to make, but to reveal. You are not a creator. You are a liberator. You must chip away everything that is not the tool." He handed the nodule to Cale. "Stop trying to break the stone. Find the tool that is sleeping inside. Wake it up." Something in Gore's words, in his sudden, uncharacteristic gentleness, shifted in Cale's mind. He picked up the hammerstone again. He held the nodule, turning it over and over, as he had seen Gore do 1,000 times. He was not looking for a place to strike. He was looking for a shape. He ignored the outer, chalky cortex, the lumps and bumps. He tried to see through them to the dark, glassy heart within. He saw a curve, a ridge line, a potential point. He saw a shape, faint and ghostly, sleeping in the stone. He knew where to strike. Not with anger, not with force, but with purpose. He raised the hammerstone. His mind was calm, his hand steady. He was not breaking. He was revealing. He struck. Crack. It was a different sound. It was clean, resonant, perfect. A large, beautiful flake detached itself from the core, its edges sharp enough to cut the wind. It was the flake he had seen in his mind. He looked up at Gore, his eyes wide with a triumphant, dawning wonder. The old man was watching him, a flicker of something ancient and deep in his pale eyes. It might have been pride. "Good," Gore rasped, turning back to his own work. "You have spoken your first word. Now the conversation can begin." The first successful strike was a key turning a lock. The world of stone, which had been a wall of silent, stubborn resistance, began to open up to Cale. The conversation Gore had spoken of was not one of words, but of feedback, of a silent dialogue between hand, eye, and material. Cale learned that a crisp, ringing sound meant the flint was of good quality, homogeneous and eager to flake, while a dull thud often preceded a frustrating, step-fractured failure. He learned to read the faint ripple lines on the surface of a fresh flake, understanding that they were a map of the energy he had just unleashed, showing him the health and structure of the core's heart. Under Gore's taciturn guidance, Cale progressed from making simple, sharp-edged flakes to be used as casual knives, to the more complex and deliberate shaping of bifaces. These were the core of the napper's art tools worked on both sides, with a central mass and a continuous cutting edge. The first was a hand axe, a teardrop-shaped tool that had to fit comfortably in the palm, its weight balanced, its edge robust enough to chop wood or butcher a large joint. His first dozen attempts were clumsy monstrosities. They were too thick, with sinuous, ineffective edges, or too thin, shattering with the final, shaping blows. Each failure was met with a grunt from Gore and a gesture towards the pile of fresh flint. The old master never told Cale what to do. He simply pointed out the flaw in the finished, failed object. "The edge wanders like a lost child," he'd rasp, tracing a thick, wavy cutting edge. Or, "This has the balance of a falling rock. It would fight your hand." It was up to Cale to decipher the cause of the failure and correct it. He learned that napping was a chain of decisions, and a single poor choice of striking platform or an ill-judged angle of blow would echo through the entire process, resulting in an inevitable final failure. The process was one of reduction in more ways than one. It reduced the stone to its essential, useful form, but it also reduced Cale. It chipped away his impatience, his youthful arrogance, his tendency to rush. He learned to sit for long periods, simply holding a core, feeling its weight, tracing its ridges, letting the path of least resistance reveal itself. His mind, once a constant chatter of anxieties and ambitions, learned a new, profound stillness. In the quiet chamber, with only the hiss of the fire and the rhythmic tap of Gore's work, Cale began to find a peace he had never known. His body changed as well. His shoulders broadened, his arms and chest thickened with the repetitive, controlled violence of the work. His hands, once soft, became calloused and scarred. A web of fine, white lines from countless cuts and scrapes crisscrossed his palms and fingers. He wore these scars not with shame, but with a growing sense of pride. They were the marks of his craft, the physical evidence of his long and difficult apprenticeship. One day, Gore deemed him ready for the next stage. He introduced Cale to a new tool, a piece of deer antler with a blunted, rounded tip. "The hammerstone is for loud talk," Gore explained. "It is for removing the stone that hides the tool. But the final words, the whispers that give the tool its true edge, are spoken with bone." This was pressure flaking. Instead of striking the stone, Cale learned to press the tip of the antler tine against the edge of his biface and apply a steady, focused pressure until a small, fine, scallop-shaped flake detached from the edge. It was a technique that required immense control and strength. The first time he tried it, his hand slipped, and the razor-sharp edge of the flint sliced deep into the fleshy part of his thumb. He hissed in pain, dropping the tool. Gore looked at the bleeding wound without emotion. He pointed to a pouch on his belt. "Moss," he grunted. Cale packed the wound with the spongy, absorbent sphagnum moss as he had seen the women do, and wrapped it tightly with a strip of hide. "The stone demands respect," Gore said, "and sometimes it demands blood. It is a reminder that what you make is a thing of life and death. Now pick it up. Your other hand is not wounded." Gritting his teeth against the throbbing pain, Cale continued. He learned to brace the tool against his leg, to use the strength of his entire body, channeling it through his shoulder and arm into the point of the antler. And slowly, painstakingly, he began to master it. He learned to create a sharp, regular, almost serrated edge, an edge that could slice through thick hide with terrifying ease. He was no longer just a boy who broke rocks. He was becoming a napper. The other members of the clan began to notice. He would bring his finished tools, a well-balanced hand axe, a set of sharp scrapers, a sturdy awl, and place them in the communal tool cache. Borin, the chieftain, picked up one of Cale's hand axes, turning it over in his hand, feeling its weight. He gave Cale a long, appraising look and a slow, single nod. It was more praise than Cale had ever received from him before. Even Turok's mockery began to lose its edge, replaced by a sullen, grudging silence. He still carried the spears he made himself, his technique one of brute force, resulting in thick, heavy points that relied on impact rather than sharpness. But he could not deny that Cale's work was different. It possessed a quality, a fineness, that his own work lacked. A silent rivalry began to smolder between them, a contest not of words, but of stone. Cale's ultimate test, the one he had been working towards since that first day of sorting rocks, was the spearhead. It was the most difficult of all tools to create. It had to be light yet strong. It had to be thin and symmetrical for true flight, yet robust enough to withstand the shock of impact with bone. It was a perfect marriage of delicacy and lethality. "Every other tool is for the hand," Gore told him, placing a flawless, palm-sized nodule of honey-colored flint before him. "The spearhead is for the air. It must love the wind. If it is clumsy, the wind will turn it aside. If it is greedy, the wind will make it fall short. You must make it a friend to the wind." Cale worked on that spearhead for 3 days. He roughed out the initial shape with a hammerstone, his blows careful and precise, each one a calculated risk. He thinned the biface with a softer hammerstone made of antler, the blows producing flatter, wider flakes that spread the thinning force across the stone. The pile of discarded flakes around him was a testament to his meticulous work. Finally, he was left with the final shape, a leaf-point biface, ready for the whispers of the antler tine. He spent an entire day just pressure flaking the edges. The world shrank to the point of contact between the antler and the stone. His breathing became slow and regular. His painting muscles, the throbbing of his thumb, the sounds of the clan outside the chamber, it all faded away. There was only him, the stone, and the tool sleeping within it. When he was finished, he held it up to the firelight. It was beautiful. It was thin, perfectly symmetrical, the edges a fearsome, regular zigzag. A central ridge ran down its length, giving it strength. The base was carefully fluted, thinned to allow it to be set securely into the split shaft of a spear. It felt alive in his hand, humming with a silent, deadly energy. It was by far the best thing he had ever made. He looked up at Gore, his chest swelling with pride. He expected, at last, a word of praise, an acknowledgement of his achievement. Gore took the spearhead from him. He turned it over, his thumb, as tough as stone itself, running over the sharp edges. He held it up to his eye, squinting down its length, checking its symmetry. He balanced it on his finger. Then, without a word, he turned and, with a flick of his wrist, threw it against the stone wall of the chamber. It shattered into a dozen useless pieces. Cale stared, his mouth agape. A hot, furious wave of disbelief and rage washed over him. 3 days of work, his masterpiece, destroyed in an instant, for no reason. "What have you done?" he roared, scrambling to his feet. His hands clenched into fists. "Why?" Gore turned his pale, icy gaze on him. For the first time, Cale saw not just age and solitude in those eyes, but a deep, ancient pain. "It was a good spearhead," Gore said, his voice quiet. "The edges were keen. The balance was true. It would have flown straight. It would have struck deep." He paused, and his gaze went to a small, worn toy spear, no bigger than his hand, that rested on a ledge in the shadows, a thing Cale had noticed but never dared ask about. "And it would have shattered on the first rib of a great cave bear, just like the one my son made the day he died." The anger drained out of Cale, replaced by a cold shock. The whispered stories were true. "You made a beautiful, sharp thing," Gore continued, his voice a low, painful rasp. "But you did not give it a strong heart. You were so in love with making it thin, with making the edges perfect, that you forgot the point of the tool. The point is not to be beautiful. The point is to endure. The point is to bring the hunter home. Your spearhead was a pretty lie. A lie that would have killed you." Cale sank to his knees, staring at the scattered, glittering fragments of his work. He understood. He had learned the technique, the grammar of the stone. But he had not yet understood its spirit, its purpose. He had been so focused on proving himself, on creating a thing of beauty that would silence Turok and impress Borin, that he had missed the most important lesson of all. Gore stood over him, not as a harsh master, but as a survivor, as one who had paid the ultimate price for a single, flawed piece of stone. "Pride is the worst flaw in any tool," the old man said softly. "It makes the napper blind. Go, get another stone. But this time, do not try to make a spearhead. Try to make a survivor." Cale looked from the shattered fragments on the floor to the old man's grief-stricken face. A profound, humbling understanding settled over him. He had come to Gore to learn how to shape stone. He was only now beginning to realize that the stone was shaping him. He rose, went to the pile of flint, and selected another nodule. His hands were steady now, not with pride, but with a new, sober purpose. The conversation was not over. It had just gotten deeper.